I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. India is second only to the United States in COVID fatalities and is experiencing a cataclysmic surge without sufficient healthcare resources. We thank our speakers today for helping us understand and report on the crisis and what the U.S. is doing and can do. Our speakers include Senator John Warner, Democrat Virginia, co-chair of the Senate India Caucus, Dr. Chris D'Souza and Dr. Rosemary D'Souza, speaking from Mumbai's Tata Memorial Hospital, Dr. Jaleel Parker, one of India's leading pulmonologists, speaking from Mumbai's Lilavati Hospital, and our cherished longtime colleague, Sandeep Roy, author and journalist based in Kolkata. Again, our deep appreciation to all of you for joining today's briefing. I now hand the briefing over to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji, veteran reporter for India West and contributing editor of Ethnic Media Services. Thank you, Sunita.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And to our speakers, thank you so much for taking the time out, especially from India, to join the call. We kick today's briefing off with Dr. Jaleel Parker, who will give us an overview of what is happening in India and how India got to this place after a relatively successful first wave. Dr. Parker, welcome.
Good morning, everybody in the Western Hemisphere, and late good evening or good night in the Eastern Hemisphere. I would like to make an opening statement by my deepest condolences to all those who have been bereaved all around the hemisphere. My deepest feelings too in regards to the same. Before I start talking about this COVID-19, I would like you all, whenever you all have time related to this COVID, I would like you all to listen to 3 songs which are always running in my mind. The number one is, Don Williams, Lord, I Hope This Day is Good. Number 2 is by Lionel Richie. You must listen to that song, which is called as, if I'm not mistaken, and a third song, which is by ABBA. Lionel Richie's song is, the name goes by the name of Goodbye, by Without You Here. Please listen to these songs. The reason why I'm telling you is because they are all related to what is going on now. And the lyrics are so beautiful and they're applicable to each and every one of us, irrespective of religion, caste, creed, all over the hemisphere. Now, having said that, let me come to COVID-19, how it came into India. It was somewhere around March the 23rd that we started getting COVID cases in the last year, that was 2020. We were actually unprepared, to be very frank with you. Nobody knew what COVID was, at least in India. But yes, 4 or 6 months earlier, the Western Hemisphere was ahead of us. So seeing their experiences, we started making whatever their experiences were applicable to us. So that's how we started. So when we started with COVID, that time it was the oral medications, which were called as HCQs and azithromycins. Then came in the ivermectin, doxycycline. Then came in the remdesivir, tocilizumab, plasma therapy, etc. And still there was no oral medication which was there in India, and that was later on it became as Fabiflu. Of course, the steroids and blood thinners were always there right from the beginning. Having said that, the COVID evolved, and as time evolved, we started evolving ourselves in the modality of treatment that was going on. So we also, I think we made certain blunders because we were too naive, or maybe we waited for the patients to become so critical that by the time we started the treatment, I think, we lost many patients. Now, the first surge that took place, we had the elderly who were getting sick. And by the time because of their reluctance, because of, I would say, whether hesitant to come to a hospital, etc., they came in at a stage where they either went on non-invasive ventilators or they went on invasive ventilators and never turned back. That was a sorry state of affairs for us. At that time in India, the medications also were not available. I myself, I nearly knocked the door up there. But it was my resilience, and I wanted to see to it that I give back to society. And I turned around. Even my wife was affected with COVID. She was next to me in the same ICU. However, we turned around, and the day I was treating me, he got infected with COVID, and he was hospitalized. So that was the scenario then. What happened was that because of the panic that was created, it was a pandemic. Of course, it was a pandemic. There's no doubt about it. We had these lockdowns because the government was left with no other options. But in those lockdowns, what happened was that the people, the migrant workers, they could not go back to their villages. And because they could not go back to their villages, they all started getting infected one after another. And because there was no social distancing amongst themselves, wearing of masks, sanitization, etc. But yes, the government of Maharashtra and the central government, they took steps to a very great extent, trying to see to it that this pandemic was brought in under control. It took us some time, but yes, we did it. And by the time things were under control, we were in the month of October or November. Now, what happened was during this period of, it was just like a tsunami that time to us. What happened was that the health workers, the police personnel, the fire brigades, the doctors, the resident doctors, the nurses, the nursing attendants, technicians, they all got tired and fatigued. And the worst part was most of them started getting infected with COVID-19. So it was a very tiring time for us, and we didn't know what to do. People said that our health system had collapsed, but I don't think so. At that stage, we had not collapsed. We were trying very hard, and we did everything possible in those days. It's not a blame game. We did everything possible. But the sheer volume that we had, we were just unable to cope up with. Now, as the first wave started regressing, it was in the month of November, December. I think everybody was quite, I would say, fed up, frustrated, being chained at home, etc. They couldn't go out. So we all let go ourselves because, and the economy also was suffering because of that, because of the lockdowns. So everybody started opening up. And to such an extent that, I think we, as citizens of India, we became quite complacent about it, about the social distancing, wearing of the mask, etc. And by this time, there was so much of, media hype, you could say, everybody going on the Google, WhatsApp, webinars, etc., that everybody was confused and didn't know what to do. Now, in this process that it so happened, the second wave was on the way. But I think we took it a little lightly. when we started realizing that how things were worst in the Western world, by the time we started taking steps, I think it reached our borders. Now, once it reached our borders, now here was a scenario where the upper middle class, the middle class, the lower rich, all those who were closeted in their apartments, they all started getting COVID. But by this time, fortunately, the good part was that we had oral medications, which could be one of the line of domiciliary treatment. So patients started taking these treatment, and vaccination had started. Now, people were apprehensive about these vaccinations because some said Pfizer was good, Moderna was good. Then they came up, no, Covishield is not good. Then they came up with Covaxin is not good. Then Sputnik, etc., etc. Now, in this meeting, many of them were reluctant to take the vaccines. But those who took the vaccines, it so happened that they did not become critical. Even though they got COVID, we could treat them at home. Unfortunately, the second wave was worse than a tsunami. It was like a nuclear bombing, a carpet bombing, wherein the middle-aged individuals were getting affected and they were coming to a hospital because they required oxygen. They had moderate COVID-19 pneumonias, or they had severe COVID-19 pneumonias. Now, in this period, the medication shortage came into place because there was such a panic, and it was all over in most of the cities and satellite townships, etc., all around. And unfortunately, what happened was, I'm not talking about the major institutes or the cities. Mumbai is one of the financial hubs of the country, that oxygen was available. But if you went to satellite townships, etc., oxygen was not available. Now, we as physicians, we are trained to save a life of a patient. We do not go into the nitty-gritties of the oxygen supply, the authorities, the chain reaction from where oxygen is going to come, etc. We are not into those. We don't have time to breathe either. It's not a blame game, but at the same time, somebody had to speak up. So we, as doctors, we started informing the management of our institutes if there was no oxygen, if there was no medications. But at the end of the day, what happened was that the patients started suffering. And when the patient starts suffering, we have no answers. And because of the shortage of, then the question came in about talking about mutation that was taking place, and the third wave and the fourth wave, etc. My bone of contention was, let's not talk about the mutation. Let's not talk about the third wave. Let's see how we can survive this second wave. That was important. And we had no answers. Now, when you don't have answers, it's like if you do, you're damned. If you don't, you're damned. So what does a physician do? What does a nurse do? If a patient comes to a hospital, if there's no oxygen, what are we supposed to give? Has the mutation research that has taken place, etc., have we come to a sort of a newer medication? No. We are still left with the same medications. We are left with, they said, and most important is all around the world, we all flip-flop. We said plasma was working, then you said plasma was not working. You said remdesivir did not change the mortality, and then so you did not want remdesivir, but you had no other option. You said tocilizumab is not good, but then they said that tocilizumab in conjunction in the critical cases turns you around, etc. So it is, everybody is responsible for what we are today as regards to COVID-19. Whether you want to talk about the medical fraternity all around the world, whether you,
Dr.
one more
Parker?
important. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. We have to stick to our timeline, and it is 9:15. I
Okay.
hope you stay on because we have a number of questions, and I hope you stay on to answer questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We next welcome Senator Mark Warner. He is a Democrat from Virginia, and he's also the co-chair of the Senate India Caucus. Senator Warner and his co-chair, Senator Cornyn, sent President Biden a letter last week asking him to ramp up aid to India. Welcome, Senator Warner. And I wonder if you could first begin by talking about what is in that $100 million package that is now scheduled to go to India.
Well, in the package, there's a variety of things. There is oxygen, there is ventilators, the United States has moved forward on sending raw materials so that particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine can be increased production in India. Let me also thank Dr. Parker for his comments, kind of what's happening both in India and on the ground. The images are horrific. I'm actually sending another letter today with John Cornyn and with Senator Portman from Ohio, saying we really need to stretch our efforts to assist India. I think it is bringing back for many Americans the images that we saw in our own country, in California, for example, in January, or last spring in New York and New Jersey. And I think it reinforces the fact that this is a global pandemic. And the idea that we have a decline of cases in the United States, that no country is an island, and simply declining cases in the United States does not mean we're safe. I hope it will drive home the point as vaccines become readily available in the United States, that individuals that have not get vaccinated. This disease can and will kill if it is allowed to go unfettered. On India in particular, I'm also happy to see that not only is the United States government moving forward, but there was an announcement today of many of the nation's leading CEOs from virtually every brand name American company at the CEO level, making a renewed commitment to get supplies. I want to be in touch with that business group. My background was in business, so I want to be in touch with that group to see how we can coordinate public sector response with private sector. Sometimes private sector can move more quickly, and I hope the firepower of the private sector will be in the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to support their colleagues. And many of these companies obviously have a presence in India. I also want to acknowledge that one of the remarkable things that's taking place was a map in the New York Times the other day. Well, we've seen the virus and horrible images of hospitals being overrun in India. This is not happening simply in India. Actually, the highest per capita rate of spread of the virus now is in Uruguay. And if you look in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, on a per capita basis, the virus is even spreading quicker in those nations. So this is really a time again for the world to come together. It is a time for America to assert its leadership, particularly because of the growing strength of the U.S.-India relationship. I have been, as chair of the India Caucus, the number of Indian American friends that I've heard from in the last 10 days. My phone and my email is blowing up on a daily basis. I have been proud of the fact that the American government is acting quickly, and I want to make sure we've got time for questions. I do want to make one other point, which is, I think it's very important that the United States, which has been the largest donor, participates in COVAX, the international vaccine effort. But I also think it's important that the United States not put all its efforts simply through COVAX. There may be, COVAX is a large bureaucratic, I think sometimes moves too slow. and the need to get vaccines on the streets in India and oxygen and ventilators, not a month from now, but tomorrow, there are certain things that can happen on a bilateral basis. I also see, for example, the United States for a long time has been supporting Jordan. Jordan has had some political challenges recently. Part of that is due to lack of vaccines. The United States could act there. I see it in North America. I've been contacted a number of times by the Jamaican government. Jamaica has virtually no vaccines. So there is a way, I think, for the United States to participate both in COVAX and in certain cases on a bilateral basis, not with the same kind of heavy-handed tactics that China and Russia has used, where they have tried to extract from those countries if they send vaccines. I think in a more traditional approach where the United States tries to gather the West, tries to gather democratic nations and lead an effort. So I'm very supportive of COVAX, but I'm also supportive of individual efforts, bilateral efforts as well. And why don't I stop at that point? So again, we've got time for questions.
Absolutely. We have a number of questions in the chat, but I wanted to start out by asking a question of how the U.S. is accounting for supplies that it is sending to India. Are we working with the Indian government? Are we working with aid agencies?
That is a great question. I believe we are mostly working through USAID, which normally has both government to government relationships, but then also has nonprofit aid distribution relationships. But that USAID network is where most of these dollars are and most of these supplies are running through. I did see that, again, just the images of some of the large military transport planes landing in India, I believe yesterday, on some of the first deliveries. But this is going to take a global effort. The scale, I know India is up to, I think, 2.1 million vaccinations a day. That's great. They're moving forward, but that's still, vaccinations alone is not going to solve India's problem. The immediacy of testing equipment, PPE, ventilators, oxygen are so critically important.
Absolutely. Khurshid Ichiporia asks a question about the saliva test. Khurshid, can you unmute yourself? I will ask the question for him. Can the USA send the saliva test that has been vetted by the FDA and available all over Illinois? It is faster, cheaper, and accurate.
I need to look into that. I've got a friend of mine who's been working on a saliva test for some time. I thought it had not been validated, but if there is a saliva test that's been approved in Illinois, let me look at this, because I do think that the future of testing, we have to get to the notion of a very quick, immediate response saliva test. But let me try to follow up, and then if I can get back, I'll relay an answer to you, Sunita, if then you can get it to your colleague who asked the question.
That would be terrific. Bulbul Rajagopal also has a question. Bulbul, could you ask your question? I think we're
Hi, Senator Warner.
There you go.
Yeah, I had a question for you, which is what can be done about lifting patents on vaccines so that the third world can access them? Because when governments and corporations put profit ahead of human welfare in this manner, isn't that a form of medical racism? Can you please comment on that? And what can the US government do? Especially when so many vaccines are available, but Americans aren't taking them, but the rest of the world is fighting to get one.
Well, we are seeing a redistribution of vaccines within the United States. There's states that are not fully using them. I would point out that the United States is talking about distributing most all of the 60 million AstraZeneca. The United States has also made more investment in COVAX than any other nation in the world. And I believe that is reflective of traditional American leadership. And so far, because they put so much into COVAX, rather than some of the heavy-handed tactics, for example, of Russia and China in terms of their vaccine diplomacy, the United States put $4 billion. Is there more that can be done? Yes, and my hope is both pressure from the United States government as well as pressure from some of these private entities to push some of the other vaccine makers to further distribution, all has to be in the mix. I think what happened was prior to the tragedy in India has put the face on the spread of the virus that was not happening before these images came forward. You saw governments like in Brazil where they've been resistant to vaccinations. There were smaller outbreaks. I think India has reinforced the fact that COVID is not behind us, and it's going to take an international effort, international collaborative effort of both governments and the private sector in a much more aggressive way than we've seen to date.
Absolutely. Senator Warner, is the Senate India Caucus attempting to coordinate some of the public-private partnerships that we are seeing?
We have so far mostly focused on pushing the Biden administration. One of the things I want to do today, having seen, I until this morning, I had heard of individual companies working with, for example, their Indian workforce, but I'd not seen a major coordinated effort. I've seen that coordinated effort announced today, and again, it is kind of a who's who of major American companies. I'm going to be in touch with that coalition today to see if there are more things that the India Caucus can do. I think many on the line, but those who don't follow India, I know this is a much broader group of ethnic press, but the Senate U.S.-India Caucus is the largest bilateral caucus in the Senate. We have over 40 members.
Fantastic. Final question for you. I'm so sorry, I lost my train of thought, but final question for you. I'm wondering, sorry, I will let you go. Thank you.
Let me assure you, I have this happen to me almost every day. One thing, let me just raise one other issue that may be a bit more controversial. I am concerned that it appears that the Modi government is trying to limit journalists and Indians themselves raising legitimate questions in social media. I think this issue, if there's false information, absolutely. But if the government is using its tools to try to limit accurate reporting of the spread of the virus, that is very dangerous. And I ask all on this line, that we need to stand behind. We need to encourage all governments to be transparent. This is a crisis, but hiding the level of the crisis will not lead to a quicker solution.
Absolutely. Senator Warner, I remember my question, and I'm going to ask you a final question. What you had mentioned at the start of your talk that you are sending a letter to Biden today, along with Senator Cornyn, and I believe you said Senator Portman. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you just brief us on the contents of that letter?
We will post that. I will post that letter right after today. But it really is basically saying, we wrote you last week. Senator Cornyn and I actually talked to the White House 10 days ago as this crisis was emerging. We basically say, thank you for what you've done, but we really need to up this effort. We want to keep the pressure on the Biden administration to acknowledge that this is a humanitarian crisis, that COVID is not contained. Until the world moves past COVID, no individual country can move past COVID. So we are simply saying, in a nutshell, thanks for what you did, but you need to do more. And we'll post that. We've said that in hopefully more diplomatic language in our letter.
What does that much more look like?
Well, I think it is much more in terms of dollars. It is much more really focused again on things like oxygen, ventilators, the things that are the most important in the crisis, and also making sure that the flow of vaccines. I mean, I think the idea of India has, as you know, an enormous biopharma industry in India. and getting some of the raw materials so that the Indian pharmaceutical industry can produce those vaccines are very important rather than simply shipping just from here. And also one of the things that we had capacity that I think the Indian government is still struggling on is that how you can set up, how you have the equipment for field hospitals. You know, when we see the images of people in Delhi and Kolkata and elsewhere being turned away from hospitals from lack of oxygen or lack of beds, if we can provide not only materials, but also logistics expertise on setting up those field hospitals, that can provide assistance. I think the sense of urgency is what we really need to understand. This, I think we're starting to see some numbers get a little bit better in India, but even a little bit better means that we're going to still have, at least till the end of May, where India will be dealing with a unprecedented crisis. And it is really our responsibility and others, but our responsibility as the world's largest economy to be there for India.
Absolutely. Could you stay on for one more question from Linda Mehta?
Sure.
Thank you. Linda, could you please ask your question?
Sorry, I wasn't expecting to be called on quite so efficiently. My question is, just a minute, I'm going to have the same memory lapse that a previous person had. Let me just bring it up so I have it right.
You have a question about removing the patents.
Right, I wanted to follow up on that question. Oh yes, I heard driving home from work yesterday on NPR, I heard that Pfizer had made over $1 billion on the vaccine already. And considering the amount of public funding that goes into the research for these and for the clinical trials, I thought that sounded excessive, and perhaps it is justified to remove the patents once the company has cashed into that level. Is the government looking at that?
I am not sure whether the government is looking at that. I am, interested in looking at what a very temporary waiver might be. I'm also looking at the, and I think President Biden is reviewing that temporary waiver request. I also think it raises, but I think, Linda, it raises a bigger issue that says, the United States in Operation Warp Speed invested enormous amount of money. Now, I think in the case of Pfizer, actually, Pfizer did not take government money, unlike many of the other vaccine companies, but it raises a more macro issue. When you have this amount of government support, should there be an obligation on the company to have some public good requirement that goes along with that, the intellectual property protections? In this case, we're trying to kind of rewrite the rules after the investments have been made. And again, I think in the case of Pfizer, but please double check me on this. I thought that Pfizer had prided itself that it had not taken money for the vaccine development, unlike most of the other companies. But I do think that the temporary waiver approach that Biden's looking at bears serious consideration.
Senator Warner, thank you so much again for joining us today. We really appreciate your comments at our briefing. We next welcome, thank you so much.
All. Thank you so much.
We next welcome Doctors Chris and Rosemary D'Souza, who both work in hospitals in Mumbai. Shall we start with Dr. Rosemary D'Souza, who is in the ICU at Nair Hospital? Rosemary, welcome. Could you tell us a little bit about what you are experiencing on the ground in the ICUs?
Yes, I have been one of the doctors placed in charge of the Kasturba Infectious Disease Hospital, which was Mumbai's only infectious disease hospital in the beginning. This was in the early part of 2020. Then subsequently, I shifted back to my hospital, Nair, where I am in charge of the ICU and I've been managing those patients right up till now. I have done an analysis of the patients who have been admitted. In the beginning, from between March to May, I have written an article which has just been published in the BMJ Open, and a total of 689 patients were included in this study of mine. And of these, 77.36 of patients were discharged and 22.64% died. 11.61% required some kind of oxygen support, while 2.8% of patients required intensive care unit admissions. Basically, the older age group, the hazard ratio being 2.88, 95% confidence limit, presence of comorbidities, history of hypertension, and presence of symptoms at the time of admission were associated with increased risk of in-hospital mortality. At that time, we only had a combination of hydroxychloroquine and steroids, which we found did not actually alter the disease course and the in-hospital mortality. The combined effect of old age and presence of comorbid conditions was more pronounced at that time. Then subsequently, I further analyzed the cases from May till about September. And I enrolled patients in the MICU where we were able to identify clinical, biochemical, and SOFA scores as factors that could initiate and indicate increased hazards of mortality. Because basically, we were only bothered about decreasing mortality here. In our study, mortality increased with age. Presence of comorbidities significantly increased the death risk of COVID-19. A higher risk of mortality was seen in patients who had chronic kidney disease and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Our analysis showed that the presence of diabetes was not significantly different between survivors and non-survivors. Obesity also did not show significant difference among survivors and non-survivors in our study. However, the presence of two or more comorbidities was associated with mortality in our study. Subsequently, in this, the second wave, I've not analyzed it as yet, but basically what I'm finding is that younger patients were affected. In the first wave, we didn't have a high mortality at all. But in this wave, I'm finding that younger patients without any comorbidities are affected. Primarily, I feel that the virus, which is this double mutant virus, this must be responsible, because in the beginning, I felt Indians had the immunity. That's why we were not so much affected in the first wave. In fact, I've done a surveillance system for individuals diagnosed at that time to identify host genetic variants associated with the disease. So we collected blood samples, and that study is still going on. So now basically I feel that among the treatment, whatever Jalil said with remdesivir and all that, the main things which work, I feel, in the ICU are proper ICU care like oxygen and proper use of ventilators. So my job in the ICU every day is basically to see if there's no oxygen leak from the port. The mask is firmly fixed onto the patient so that all the oxygen goes into the patient. Then to monitor the oxygen saturations, measure the PF ratio, and if we find that the work of breathing is increased and the saturations decrease, then to intubate the patient and put the patient on invasive ventilation. So basically, I feel like in India, basically only 1.3% of the GDP is for health. But in Mumbai, it was not like that, because the BMC came forth, and the BMC, as you know, is a very rich, one of the richest corporations. So they managed it by supplying oxygen. So we actually in Mumbai and in Naya Hospital, we are not short of oxygen or ventilators or anything. So now I feel the main crux of treatment is only with steroids and the anticoagulants, that's low molecular weight heparin. Of course, I've also noticed that those people who have been vaccinated with both the doses of vaccine, the mortality is very low. In fact, I've not seen any deaths with patients who have been vaccinated with both doses of the vaccine. So I feel the vaccination now is the main thing. In the beginning, people were a bit reluctant to take it. Now, actually, they're quite desperate to take the vaccine. So I feel now the mainstay of treatment in the ICU is just proper ICU care like any other patient with steroids and heparin. a proper ventilation, and to decide when you have to give non-invasive ventilation, when you give invasive ventilation. And of course, we have the reverse osmosis plants essential for dialysis for COVID patients, non-COVID, and the suspect patients. So with this, I would say that I think the second wave is more lethal and more infectious because of the mutant, the virus. And I feel if vaccination helps with, if this is given to most people, then the mortality will definitely decrease. Thank you.
There are several questions in the chat, and I wonder, Rosemary D'Souza, if we could answer those questions before we move on to Dr. Chris D'Souza.
Yes.
So,
no, I can't hear you.
Hello. You
VG
can't be.
Sundram, could you please ask your question? I will ask it for her. VG asked, did you test hydroxychloroquine?
Yes. So as I told you in the beginning, when we were treating patients from March to May, hydroxychloroquine was the mainstay of treatment at that time because we didn't know anything more. And it was promoted at all levels as an immunomodulator, one that could help the body produce defense against the virus. There were many contradictory reports on its effectiveness. So when I did the analysis of these patients, even those patients who were on hydroxychloroquine, antiviral, other antivirals like lopinavir, I found there was no difference in their mortality compared to those who were on the other, who were given nothing, absolutely. There was no difference in the mortality. So now, in fact, we do not use hydroxychloroquine at all. The mainstay of treatment is steroids, as I said, and anticoagulants, and of course, ventilation.
Jaya Padmanabhan has an interesting question. Jaya.
Thank you, Sunita, and for this briefing. What do you see in the road ahead in the next month and in the longer term, given the study, given the analysis that you have done?
Yes, I haven't analyzed now the second wave as yet. I've just collected the patient data. But what I feel is that there are many young patients which are coming without any comorbidities, unlike in the first wave. And the mortality is very high at this time, at this stage, because basically the patients are coming very breathless. Even there are a lot of pregnant patients who are coming absolutely breathless. So at that time, besides the standard ICU care and steroids and heparin, we cannot, even remdesivir won't work at this time because it's more than 10 days from the onset of the illness. So we are only just ventilating them well with oxygen. And that's the only treatment which we can give at this stage. So, but I've definitely found that those who have been vaccinated, have taken both doses of the vaccine, have not died. The mortality is significantly less.
Could you
so
take
I would
one more?
encourage everyone to be vaccinated.
Thank you. Could you take one more question from Sandeep Roy?
Yes.
Hi, Dr. D'Souza. I just wanted to ask you whether are you seeing more infections than you expected for people who have already been vaccinated? I know you said the mortality is low and you haven't seen anyone die who has been vaccinated, but are you seeing more, especially with the new mutant out there? Because Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, the doctor writer, had raised this issue, whether we need to do a study to see if the vaccines being used in India are as effective as hoped against the new mutant, the double mutant.
Yes, those who have not been vaccinated or who have just got one vaccination dose, there are many patients who are admitted in the hospital. But that's okay because they've been, they can survive. So I'm really not worried about that. And as you know, I was on the trial for even plasma therapy. I was on the ICMR trial for that. I was on the Solidarity trial, WHO. And ultimately, whatever came out from both the results, there was no difference in the 28 mortality or progression to severe disease among moderately ill COVID-19 patients treated with convalescent plasma or even with those repurposed antiviral drugs for COVID-19. Including itolizumab, which was one of those monoclonal antibodies which showed some benefit, but the phase 4 trial results have not yet come out. So even problem is also those who are vaccinated, like maybe they were standing in long lines now. So they can get infected even at that time because there's no social distancing and even without masks. So I wouldn't say that the vaccine is responsible for this.
Dr. D'Souza, thank you so much. We'll move on to your husband, Chris.
Hello, good morning, everybody. And I really appreciate everybody attending this and the outpouring of support for the catastrophic situation that is unfolding in India. I'm going to present a totally different dimension. I'm privileged to live in and practice in Mumbai, and the figures of infections, etc., are much lower here than they are in the rest of the country. In addition, we face no real shortage of oxygen. I will be just relating to you a few things about how I deal with non-COVID patients at the time of this COVID pandemic. I've been involved in the treatment of very poor, marginalized slum children who are deaf. And we insert these devices called cochlear implants, which allow them to regain their hearing. Now, it's absolutely imperative that we implant them before the age of 2. So this is a time-bound surgery. That means neither they nor I have the luxury of waiting until things slow down. So we've had to implant these children by the age of 2. Now, this has posed is a multi-dimensional problem because these children, as I said, are poor and marginalized. So they come from slums where there's virtually no social distancing. But the important thing is that before, during, and after the surgery, we ensured that the patient and the caregivers, the parents and the relatives around, were COVID-free. I'm talking 2 stages: last year, where there was no vaccine available, and this year. Now, the hospitals, the Holy Family Hospital, the Leelavati Hospital, and the Holy Spirit Hospital gave me a lot of latitude. So we arranged it such that before, during, and after, the patients and their relatives were not COVID positive. And neither were the staff. Now this, we made sure that at all times, the patients had their masks on, and they had their face shields, and they were indulged in frequent hand washing. This was an entirely new protocol to them. This was something totally alien since they hailed from the slums, where hygiene was not really on a priority. But with counseling from our team, we made sure that they follow these things, and we led by example. So these children, many who were operated on last year, did not get COVID. Now, even during the second wave, like I said, we didn't have a problem with oxygen. So we were allowed to perform surgery which were time bound. And even this year, when we did a few, none of them became COVID positive. And neither did the relatives have access to the vaccine. So all I can say from this observation is that it's true that wearing a mask, a face shield, social distance as best you can, but most frequently are more imperatively that they indulge in frequent hand washing. And right till this date, none of them have tested COVID positive. They've had to come to the hospital for switching on the device and the like, and none of them have tested COVID positive. Now, virtually, many of these patients were funded by the Vatican by donations from the church. And we had to give reports to the various trusts. And our activities earned us a papal citation commending us on our good work. Of course, at all times, we wanted to make sure that we did not get overconfident, that we made sure the situation was just right, so that the patient was not exposed to COVID-19 at all. The second dimension is that with patients who had cancer. Now, very often, I noticed in the early part of the COVID pandemic, many patients who were, had the early stages of cancer, they delayed seeking treatment and then landed up being inoperable. And there was a heart-rending story. I went to an old age home, and there was this lady who had cancer, and she delayed treatment, and then finally she was in the terminal stage of cancer. So I was just speaking to the relatives, and I was just shaking my head and saying, "Oh dear, I really wish that she had sought treatment earlier." The lady herself said, "I'd much rather die of cancer than of COVID." So I was a bit taken aback by that statement. So I said, "Why do you say so?" "Well, with COVID, I'll be, gasping for breath, and I see all these pictures, and so I'd much rather go with cancer rather than with COVID. It's such a painful disease." So all these images that play out fill patients with apprehension, and many of them delay seeking treatment. And this has disturbed me, my wife, greatly, to see that sometimes we just wait impotently as, we try to get patients to understand the urgency of seeking treatment, and that we're there, we don't turn away patients. And like very often there were these Zoom calls and, teleconferencing and things like that. Now, if a person has a foreign body in the throat, for example, fish won't stop there. Telephonic consultation are going to remove it. So we as doctors have to get out of ourselves and assist these patients. And at a time of a catastrophe like this, reminded of JFK's saying during his inaugural address, and that is, we should not ask what our country can do for us. We should ask what we can do for our country and our countrymen. I've also been involved in the, yes.
Dr. D'Souza, we're going to move on to Sandeep Roy, but we hope that you will stay on for questions.
I will.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandeep Roy is a journalist living in Kolkata, who is going to give us an on-the-ground report from Kolkata. Sandeep, welcome.
Thank you, Sunita, and hello to everybody. Some of you are old friends. So hi from Kolkata. I feel a little bit like I should sort of preface my remarks by just saying that unlike the doctors you heard from before, I am nowhere frontline worker or even reporter on this. So all I can do is give you some observations about living here in the middle of the pandemic. I won't pretend to be on the front lines of fighting the pandemic or even reporting on it. In the last 28 days in April, I think there were numbers that said about 50 journalists had died of COVID, because they are reporting from crematoriums or hospitals every day and exposing themselves. In terms of what it feels like to live here, it's very strange. I don't think I've ever experienced this kind of state of anxiety in India, in a country which has many problems all the time. There are many other epidemics have happened, many other sort of stressful situations, but this has been a constant thing for over a year. But compared to the first wave, I feel like for many of us, the first wave, you have to remember that when the Indian Prime Minister first instituted the nationwide lockdown a year ago in March, there were 500 registered cases in the country. So for most of us, we were sort of, the first wave was something we watched on television. We saw the images of the migrants, as Dr. Parker was saying, coming, trying to walk across India, go back to their villages. But, we were, those who had the privilege were working from home, stuck at home, and we were worried and scared. And there were many instances of elderly people with comorbidities getting sick, but it was still, it felt like largely something we were watching on television. The second wave has really come home to us, or not just knocking at our doors. The second wave is inside our house, literally, because every single day I get a message from somebody or the other about someone is sick or someone's family member has fallen sick. If you look at Indian social media right now, it is just awash with calls for help from people looking for oxygen cylinders, looking for oxygen concentrators, words that the lay public did not even know before. I mean, none of us knew what an oxygen concentrator did. We may have known about an oxygen cylinder, or looking for an ICU bed. And it is remarkable how civil society has stepped up to try and amplify this and get people the resources they need. But that was not something we really saw in the first wave. You know, in this second wave, just a couple of days ago, a friend of mine sent a message, who's a doctor, and he sent a message saying, my wife lost her uncle yesterday in the city of Kanpur with COVID, and he died in the back of a taxi looking for a bed. He literally died in a taxi cab looking for a bed. These are stories. I think some of it is also a measure of privilege, that these stories are making a lot more news because people like us who have an immense amount of privilege are also being hugely affected by COVID. COVID is a disease that is striking high-rise communities and gated communities as much as it is striking slums right now. And in India, I think for a long time, and there was an article in The Atlantic which made this point, we have practiced this thing where the well-to-do, we can create bubbles for ourselves, and we think we have access to the best healthcare, you know, because we can pay for it. And we have maybe not paid enough attention to the public health infrastructure, but now the virus has come and burst this bubble of denial that we had built for ourselves. And I think one of the larger issues has been whether India got complacent because the numbers had been going down in India. And, you know, I think it is wonderful now that, as Senator Warner was saying, that the whole world has been stepping up to help India in its time of need. It is a sign of sort of the social capital India enjoys in the world, and also its geopolitical importance. But I would like to think that the world would step up to help, even if the country was not necessarily geopolitically, strategically important, but because it was the right thing to do. But it also cannot excuse us from not being, having ramped up our facilities enough in the year that we've had since this pandemic started in terms of, and I think this has sort of shown us that what more we could have done. I mean, could we have set up more oxygen plants, for example? There were a lot more oxygen plants that were requisitioned over the last year, but only a fraction of them were built. Now we're trying to build them at top speed. There's an oxygen express that's train that is taking oxygen to parts of India. We are getting equipment from around the world. Probably some of it, hindsight is always 2020, and probably some of it could have been done before. And I think the issue that we should point out is, what does it look like for the future? Right now, where I am in Kolkata, I just saw a report that said a testing lab had said that every second test that they were doing, RT-PCR test, was coming back positive. And that does not count for the number of people who are asymptomatic and therefore not getting tested at all. And as you know, we just had month-long elections in this state. And while the jury is out as to how much exactly the election rallies and all of that contributed to the rise of the pandemic in a state like West Bengal and a city like Kolkata, but certainly these enormous rallies could not have helped restrain the pandemic. They certainly could not have done that. And in fact, some studies have shown that around the 1st of March, the rates of infection in the states in India which went to elections were about the same as the states that did not have elections. By the 15th of April, it was double in the states that were going into elections. So there is some sort of evidence out there which may be collateral. But apart from that, I think you know, one of the things about leading ordinary life here is that every encounter has started to feel like a game of Russian roulette. Every time you go out, you feel like this might be the time you bring the virus home. And, you know, on Twitter, I'm seeing a journalist trying desperately to organize oxygen for her mother because she herself is stuck at home with the whole family down with COVID. And that is a larger situation. When your whole family is down with COVID, how do you organize help for other members who might be actually needing it? Right, and a friend of mine said with rather morbid humor that when his father tested positive for COVID, he sort of joked rather morbidly that instead of wasting time trying to organize oxygen cylinders, he should go and take a token at the crematorium, because he'd heard there'd been a sort of a traffic jam of bodies at the crematorium and people were being given tokens. But that sort of morbid humor alive in a way shows that, you know, people still going on. But it is, I think there has been a mathematical model that has come out of the University of Michigan that is projecting a peak of about 800,000 daily new infections over the coming weeks, which is double the current level. And that model is also saying that in May, at least 100,000 people will die. And the Indian Institute of Technology has also been doing its mathematical models, which they just adjusted. And they're showing a peak of 3.8 million to 4.8 million between May 14th and 18th. So everyone is looking at the next 2 weeks, and probably the doctors on the panel could talk to us a little bit more about that. The next 2 weeks as being really critical. And at the same time, I think one of the big problems here is that while the virus pandemic is raging through the country like wildfire, our vaccination has run into issues because we are not being able to vaccinate fast enough. I mean, it is a huge country. It's logistically a massive challenge. But right now, for example, in the state of Bengal, where I am, I myself, my own second dose appointment just got canceled. And when I look at the app where to try and book another appointment, it shows no slots are available currently for the entire month of May because no vaccines are available. Many of the private hospitals here have actually stopped vaccination in Kolkata because they don't have enough vaccine stocks. The government has asked the center to provide, I think, 4 million doses of COVID vaccines for May. As of now, a consignment of 500,000 is headed for the state. So there's obviously going to be this huge mismatch. And the longer we wait on the vaccines, the more this gap starts to loom. Right now, I believe the last I heard, about 23 million Indians had been vaccinated. That's not even 10% of the government's own target of 300 million, which it wanted to inoculate by August. So it's kind of like a bit of a worst of both worlds scenario where the virus infection rate has been skyrocketing. And at the same time, the country is struggling to keep up with the vaccination. And one of the things to remember is that it is the same staff in the same hospitals from which our doctors are present who are dealing with taking care of people who are coming in with the illness and infection, as well as trying to do the vaccination. So that is sort of double duty. And I think one of the things that India will have to reckon with is the immense stress and impact that this will have on the medical system here, on doctors like the people who are on this program. And I have heard from many doctor friends talking about the enormous psychological stress that they have been feeling going through this year of being in this state of hypervigilance. You know, I have a friend of mine who is counseling COVID families who volunteer to, says that he is getting depressed in terms of, like how much counsel and how much solace can you offer so many desperate people who are all coming at the same time. So that impact, the psychological impact, we don't want to often think about it because you're dealing with fighting fires right now. But the psychological impact will have repercussions on all of us for a long time to come.
Sandeep, thank you so much for your comments. Very much appreciated. As a journalist, do you believe that the official numbers have been underreported, the number of deaths and the number of daily new infections?
Yeah, I think the Dr. Bhramar Mukherjee, who is an epidemiologist at the University of Michigan, has in fact talked about this. And if you look at her study, she in fact has an estimate about the degree to which they have been underreported, so yes, I think it has been underreported, probably partly because not enough testing was being done. In fact, I think I just read an article in the newspaper which said that if you add up the numbers that each of the states of India are reporting about the number of tests they're doing, and compare it with the sort of centralized number from the Indian Council of Medical Research, those totals are not matching right now. And so there is a lot of pressure. You know, in India, because we have gone through a crippling lockdown, governments and politicians are very resistant to going into any other kind of lockdown again. So there is a temptation sometimes to keep your ratios somewhat low. And so sometimes that would mean that you try to, you know, last time the most common thing was a lot of people were their death certificates were being issued on the basis of the comorbidity that they died of rather than COVID, which was not just a problem in India, it's a worldwide problem. So the numbers were always a little fudgy as to whether this person died of COVID or because they also had diabetes and was that being as the cause of death. So that, as well as, you know, I think the ramping up, testing has been ramped up a lot, but right now, again, because it has been going like wildfire, I know that a lot of people who require RT-PCR tests right now are finding it hard to get a test done, or they're at least having to wait, you know, whereas before you could get it that day, they're needing to wait 72 hours or more to get the results of the test when they're able to get it.
Thank you again, Sandeep. I have a question for all the doctors. How do we move forward out of this? People are talking about the next wave happening in November as air quality gets poorer. I wonder what steps India can take to mitigate that third wave that's ahead. Dr. Chris D'Souza, can we start with you and then move on to Rosemary and then Dr. Parkar? You're muted. There you go.
The next step is that while waiting for the vaccine to come, again, wearing a mask, social distancing, frequent hand washing is very, very important. Now, also for satellite problems like cancer and other things like that, people need to seek treatment urgently because hospitals have a department where you can get treatment for non-COVID problems. And even if you're non-COVID, without running the gauntlet of contracting COVID from the ward or from the hospital. So we've written a book with people from all over the US called Head and Neck Cancer Care in the Pandemic, Prioritizing Care, so that physicians who are unsure, doctors unsure, can look at this book and then know what are the protocols to be followed. The same thing is that we're writing a book with Dr. Paul Marek and Jose Iglesias and others on challenges in the pandemic, because we don't expect this to go away soon. So how to sort out vital things from the noise around. If people are, a statement is made, then a couple of days later it is retracted. So there's a lot of confusion. So for the layman on the road, get vaccinated at the earliest. If you can't and you're waiting for the vaccine, wear a mask, face shield, social distancing, and frequent hand washing. For the doctors who are treating these patients, again, they should themselves get vaccinated and be good examples by wearing a mask, social distancing, and the like. These things will help make sure that the curve flattens, and by being good examples and being available for patients, this will encourage patients who have other allied problems to come there, seek timely treatment. Thank you. President.
Hello?
Yeah, yes, Sunita, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Rosemary, yes.
Yeah, in addition to what Chris has said, I feel also that it has the admissions are definitely going down. It is becoming better. I feel because of the lockdown which has been imposed. So the rate of infections have definitely come down, and even the admissions. Also, the BMC has an online, it's an algorithm which was established and managed by the war rooms in different wards, which coordinate admissions, transfers, etc. So on this online dashboard, the patient admissions are always updated. and there are doctors to go to the patient homes and to get them on time, because basically what I'm finding is that when you get this disease, it's a question of coming on time. So usually from the onset of symptoms between the 5th and the 14th day is the dangerous time when the cytokine storm, or as we call it, the inflammatory syndrome starts. So if you come early, and also there is a thing called happy hypoxia in these patients, where the patient is very comfortable, but the saturations go down. So even in the slums of Dharavi and Worli, there are people on the ground who tell these people how to monitor their saturations, give a pulse oximeter to these patients. So they come on time, so that they come on time, and before they go into the cytokine storm, you can give them antivirals to prevent them from going into that storm.
Fantastic. Dr. Parkar.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the D'Souza couple has covered quite well. So I'll just add a few points, and that is maintaining social distancing, sanitization, wearing masks, vaccination, testing, identification, and follow-up. These are the main things that people should do, and get prepared if there's going to be a third wave, if there's going to be a surge. Most importantly is that they should not delay coming to the hospital if their saturation drops. Many a times people feel that it's only the saturation. It's not that. It's not just the saturation, but it's also a clinical acumen that a physician has learned over a period of times, more than a year, where he can identify immediately and treat the patient accordingly. And I think the government is striving very hard to see to it that all medications are in place, oxygen is in place. We are a huge country with a huge population. If the Western world, I should say, if the Western world health system has collapsed, I think nobody should be surprised if we have collapsed to an extent. But at the same time, we should be on our guard, improvise, and see to it that all these facilities are available so that the patients get a prompt treatment and they go back home safe and sound to their family. Thank you.
To all the speakers on the call, thank you so much for joining us. Your insights were enormously useful. Thank you to everyone for joining. Have a good week.